Hello everyone, in this video I will show you some tips and tricks I use to create the animations you see here. This is a scene of a larger personal project I'm currently working on. This will be more a behind the scenes approach, so that I can share with you more of my workflow and process in a shorter amount of time. So let's take a look. You can currently see the view from the main camera. Now let's zoom out a bit and take a look what happens behind the scenes. I only created the objects that are visible from the camera or affect the light and reflections in a certain way. For the vegetation, that includes the trees, bushes and grass, I used the botanic add-on. But it is just what works for me. You can use any add-on you like or even your own assets. This is just a personal preference. The geometry of the architecture is fairly simple. For the arches, I just modeled one side, then used the mirror and array modifier to create the whole raw. Afterwards, I just duplicated it and joined everything together. The roof is a flat cube with another flat cube as a boolean. And the floor looks like this. Really nothing fancy. For the handles, I created this node setup in geometry nodes to have free control over the shape of the pipe. As a main object, I use the spline. With this node here, I can adjust the radius in the corners and this node controls the diameter of the pipe. The main light is the sunlight and an HDRI for the environment. It was important to me to show the arc from the arches on the floor, but it gave me a problem with the light shaft. By using a hole in the ceiling, the light always fell around here and left everything else in the dark. It took me quite some iterations to figure out the ideal lighting for the light shaft. Finally, I decided to fake it and make it visually appealing instead of realistic. I mean, swimming in a pool of clouds. So much for realism. The light of the light shaft consists of two area lights, one that illuminates the walls of the shaft itself and one that throws some soft light around the pool. This is the whole light setup for the environment and architecture. The light setup for the clouds is a bit different, but more of it later. The texturing is mainly created by UV map textures, but for the floor I had to use a trick to avoid a visible repetition. The problem with the floor was that if I only use one texture, there will be a visible repetition, as you can see in the back of the room. So what I did was to take the same texture twice and rotate each of them in a different angle. To mix the two textures together, I used a noise texture with a color ramp and plugged it in the mix factor of the mix RGB node. This way I could avoid a visible repetition. It is not perfect, but it does the job quite well. The next trick I want to share is how to control repeating patterns with an empty. In my case, the floor has tiles in the normal map, as you can see here. To control the alignment, I set the texture coordinate to object and select the empty as the object. Now I can move and scale the empty in the 3D scene to align the tiles of the texture to the geometry. The final challenge was to add some nice looking clouds inside the pool. First I created a base mesh for the clouds using the displacement modifier and some basic icospheres. Then I threw a remesh modifier on top of it. This was the foundation for the volume object. I added 3 levels of detail with the volume displacement modifier. The next step was to make the clouds look nice. In my case, I was not happy how the clouds looked like with the main lighting setup from the scene, so I created a separate setup only for them. By adding some colors into the light, I could enhance the readability of the soft and translucent material. Finally, I rendered the clouds, the architectural elements, and the vegetation each separately and compose them together in After Effects. This gave me the most freedom to adjust the contrast and colors of each layer in the post-process. An additional benefit of having the elements on separate layers is you can render them out with a different sample count. You can also fake the depth of field by adding some subtle blur to one of the layers, as I did here with the vegetation layer. This helps to keep the focus on the front layers and main objects in the scene. So that's all for this video. Hope you learned something and see you next time.